My father stood in front of 40 guests at our Memorial Day barbecue and laughed at my 8-year-old car. He called me a boring spinster who was married to a spreadsheet, completely unaware that for 5 years, my spreadsheets were the only thing keeping him out of bankruptcy. When he told me to open my little envelope in front of the whole family, he expected a check to save his sinking business. He did not expect a $7 million foreclosure notice with my name on the top line. Let me tell you how a quiet commercial underwriter finally balanced the family ledger. I am 32 years old and I work as a senior commercial underwriter. My job is to look at a business, read the financial statements, and find the lie. I calculate risk. I find the hidden debts, the inflated projections, and the bad bets. But when it came to my own family, I turned that part of my brain off completely. I thought turning a blind eye was the price of admission to my family. For 5 years, I had been the silent financial spine of my parents' household. My father, Richard, owned a wholesale supply business that he claimed was constantly on the brink of collapse. When I was 27, he sat me down at his kitchen table, cried real tears, and told me he was going to lose the house. I did not ask to see his balance sheets. I did not ask for proof. I simply set up an automatic wire transfer. $4,000 a month every first of the month, straight from my checking account to his. Over 5 years, that is $240,000. To afford it, I lived in a small one-bedroom condo. I drove a sedan with a failing transmission and peeling paint. I packed my lunches. I skipped vacations. I told my friends I was aggressively saving for early retirement. The truth was, I was aggressively funding my father's pride. And my father had a lot of pride. You could see it clearly that Memorial Day. Richard and my mother, Susan, were hosting their annual kickoff to summer barbecue. The backyard of their 5-bedroom suburban home was immaculate. There were string lights woven through the oak trees, a rented margarita machine, and a catered spread of smoked brisket and grilled salmon. I stood near the patio steps, holding a plastic cup of tap water, calculating the cost of the party in my head. Easily $2,000. A strange expense for a man who had texted me 4 days prior, asking if I could wire my monthly contribution a week early to cover payroll. I did not bring it up. I never brought it up. I just stood quietly and watched my family perform. The performance was mostly for the benefit of the neighbors and the church elders, but the star of the show was always my younger sister, Taylor. Taylor is 28, blonde, loud, and immune to the concept of consequences. She is the golden child. She never had to help with the bills. She married a man named Brent 2 years ago. Brent calls himself a real estate developer. He wears tailored polo shirts, expensive loafers, and talks about capital gains at a volume designed to make sure everyone in a 20-foot radius knows he understands money. Richard was standing by the massive stainless steel grill, holding a pair of tongs like a scepter. He had a captive audience of uncles and neighbors. I made the mistake of walking past to throw away a napkin. Richard caught my arm. "Look who decided to emerge from her cubicle," he announced, his voice booming over the music. "Claire, you look tired. They working you to death at that boring desk job." A few of the neighbors chuckled politely. I kept my face perfectly neutral. "I am doing fine, Dad." He turned to his audience. "My oldest daughter, folks, 32 and married to a spreadsheet. I keep telling her she needs to learn how to live a little. Take a risk. Look at Taylor and Brent." He gestured across the yard with his tongs. Taylor and Brent were leaning against Brent's brand new imported SUV, laughing loudly. "Now, that is how you do it." Richard continued, making sure his voice carried. Brent just closed another massive deal. He is a builder, a visionary. Meanwhile, Claire rolled up today in that 8-year-old sedan. I swear the paint is peeling so bad, it brings down the property value of the whole neighborhood. I keep telling her to upgrade, but she pinches pennies so hard, Lincoln screams. The men around the grill laughed loudly this time. My mother, Susan, was standing nearby arranging potato salad. She did not defend me. She just smiled her warm, practiced smile and said, "Claire has always been our practical girl. Not much for excitement, but she gets by." I stood there in my discount store blouse and looked at the man whose so-called failing business had consumed every spare dollar I had earned for half a decade. He was humiliating me to elevate his own status. He needed to be the generous, wealthy patriarch, and he needed me to be the pathetic, penny-pinching spinster daughter to make the contrast work. He had no idea that I pinched those pennies so he could afford the very brisket he was serving to his friends. I did not argue. I did not yell. I just nodded and stepped away from the grill. I thought the public shaming was the worst part of the afternoon. I was wrong. The shaming was just the warm-up act. An hour later, the guests started migrating toward the front yard to watch a neighborhood parade. The backyard emptied out. I was gathering empty plates near the patio when Richard stepped into my path. The jovial, booming patriarch vanished. His face was tight, his jaw set, and his eyes darted around to make sure no one else was in earshot. "Claire, come here," he said. It was not a request. He walked toward the far corner of the yard, near the tall privacy fence. I followed him, holding a stack of dirty paper plates. Susan materialized from the kitchen door and joined us. The two of them stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a wall between me and the rest of the party. The temperature of the conversation dropped to freezing. "I need a lump sum," Richard said, skipping any preamble. The wholesale business took a massive hit this quarter. Supply chain issues. A vendor backed out. I have invoices due by Friday, and if I do not clear them, they are going to force me into bankruptcy. I will lose the warehouse. I will lose everything. I felt the familiar heavy weight settle in my chest, the weight of being the family fixer. "How much, Dad?" $50,000, he said, not blinking. I stared at him. $50,000. I do not have $50,000 in cash, Dad. I give you $4,000 every month. My savings account is completely bare. I just had to put my car repairs on a credit card. Richard waved his hand dismissively as if my financial reality was a minor annoyance he did not have time to indulge. "I know you do not have the cash, but you have equity." I froze. "Equity. Your condo." He continued, his tone brisk and entirely too calculated. "You have been paying the mortgage on that place for 7 years. The market went up. You have at least $100,000 in equity sitting right there doing nothing. You can take out a home equity line of credit. A HELOC." I looked at my father, truly looked at him. He had already appraised my home. He had done the math on my life to see how much more blood he could squeeze from the stone. "Dad, I cannot take out a second mortgage on my home to pay your business debts. If you default, I lose my condo. I will be homeless. I am already stretching myself to the breaking point for you." Susan stepped forward. She put her hand on my arm, her grip tight, her voice laced with that toxic, sugary guilt she had perfected over 3 decades. "Claire, do not be dramatic. No one is going to be homeless. Your father is just asking for a bridge loan. A temporary fix. Family takes care of family. We gave you everything. We clothed you, we fed you, we paid for your braces when you were 12. And now, when your father is drowning, you are going to hoard your little condo and watch him go under." I looked at my mother. I wanted to ask her if clothing and feeding your child was a loan that required repayment with interest. I wanted to ask her why Taylor, who had a wealthy husband, was never asked to leverage her home. But I already knew the answer. Taylor was the daughter they showed off. I was the daughter they spent. "It is too much risk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I am an underwriter. I know what happens when you secure unsecured business debt against a primary residence. It is financial suicide." Richard stepped closer. His face was red, his anger bubbling just beneath the surface. He hated when I used my professional knowledge against his demands. He hated being reminded that I actually knew how money worked. "You are not an underwriter right now, Claire. You are my daughter. And I am telling you, if you do not do this, the family name is ruined. Taylor and Brent will have to deal with the fallout of my bankruptcy, ruining their local reputation. You are going to destroy your sister's happiness because you are too cowardly to sign a piece of paper." He played the Taylor card. He always played the Taylor card. He knew it was the ultimate weapon in the family arsenal. If I said no, I would not just be the bad daughter. I would be the villain who ruined the golden child's perfect life. "I just need time to think," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I need to look at your books. I need to see exactly where this $50,000 is going before I risk my home." "There is no time to think," Richard snapped. The bank needs the application submitted by tomorrow morning if we are going to clear the funds by Friday." "Application," I echoed, confused. "I already filled it out," he said, his voice flat, completely devoid of shame. "I called your bank. I got the standard HELOC forms. I filled in all your employment details. I know what you make. All you have to do is review it and sign the bottom line. I will take it to the bank myself tomorrow." A cold chill washed over me. He had already filled out a loan application in my name. He had gathered my financial data, my income, my property details, and prepared the paperwork without my consent. He did not view me as an independent adult. He viewed me as an extension of his own wallet, an asset to be liquidated when convenient. "Go into the house," Richard commanded, pointing toward the sliding glass door. "Go into my home office. The computer is on. The PDF is sitting right on the desktop. It is labeled Claire Loan Application. Open it, print it, sign it, and bring it back out here." I stood frozen, holding the stack of dirty paper plates. Susan patted my cheek, her eyes hard and unyielding. "Go on, sweetheart. Do the right thing. Save your family. Do not come back outside until it is signed." I did not argue. Arguing with them when they formed a united front was like arguing with a brick wall. I turned around and walked up the patio steps, sliding the glass door open and stepping into the cool, air-conditioned quiet of the house. The living room was empty. The kitchen was covered in prep trays and half-empty serving bowls. I walked down the hallway toward the back of the house where Richard kept his home office. My stomach was in knots. I felt sick, physically sick, at the thought of putting my signature on a document that would tie my only safe haven, my small condo, to my father's chaotic business practices. I approached the heavy oak door of his study. I pushed it open. The room smelled like leather and expensive cologne. Richard had a massive mahogany desk dominating the center of the room. On top of the desk sat his dual-monitor computer setup. I walked around the desk and sat in his heavy leather chair. I reached for the mouse to wake up the screens. I fully intended to open the PDF, print the document, and try to find a way to stall him for a few days. I thought this was just another chapter in the endless saga of my father's financial mismanagement. I thought I was just going to be looking at a standard bank form. I wiggled the mouse. The dual monitors flared to life, bright and sharp in the dim office. Richard had left the computer unlocked. He had left his browser open. But the PDF labeled Claire Loan Application was not the active window. The active window was an email inbox. Brent's email inbox. Brent must have used the office computer earlier in the day to check his messages and forgot to log out. My hand hovered over the mouse. I was about to minimize the browser to find my father's loan document on the desktop, but my eyes caught the subject line of the email currently open on the main screen. It was an email from a commercial lender at a major regional bank. The subject line was written in bold black letters: Rio Creek Plaza, $7 million valuation and capital call. I froze. $7 million valuation. I stared at the screen. I am a commercial underwriter. I read subject lines exactly like this every single day at my firm. I know what they mean. They mean massive commercial developments. They mean high-tier real estate syndication. I looked at the recipients of the email. It was addressed to Brent, and copied directly on the chain was my father, Richard. I did not minimize the window. I clicked on the email thread. I leaned closer to the monitor. And what I found in those attachments was about to change the trajectory of my entire life and tear my family completely apart. The heavy oak door of my father's study clicked shut, cutting off the loud music and the laughter from the backyard. The room was cool and smelled of expensive leather and citrus cologne. My father treated this room like a sanctuary. It was where he supposedly agonized over his failing wholesale business late into the night. I walked around the massive mahogany desk and sat in his heavy executive chair. My heart was beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had every intention of finding the loan document on his desktop. I planned to print it, fold it into my purse, and spend the next 3 days inventing an excuse to delay the home equity loan. I touched the mouse. The dual monitors flared to life. The bright light cut through the dim room. My father had left the computer unlocked. He had also left a web browser open. It was not his account. The profile picture in the top corner belonged to my brother-in-law, Brent. Brent must have slipped into the house earlier to check his messages and carelessly walked away without logging out. I moved the cursor toward the minimize button, but my hand stopped. The active window displayed an open email thread. The subject line was written in bold black text. Oak Creek Plaza, $7 million valuation capital call. I am a commercial underwriter. I read subject lines exactly like this every single day at my firm. I know the vocabulary of high-tier real estate syndication. A capital call is a demand for cash from investors to fund a massive project. A $7 million valuation means someone is building a premium commercial asset. My father had just stood by the margarita machine and told me he was facing imminent bankruptcy. He told me he could not pay his warehouse vendors. Bankrupt men dealing with supply chain issues do not get copied on capital calls for retail plazas. I did not minimize the window. I pulled my hand back from the mouse for a second, feeling a strange coldness wash over my skin. Then I leaned forward and clicked on the email thread. The message was from a senior commercial lender at a major regional bank. It was addressed directly to Brent. My father was carbon copied. The body of the email was brief and professional. It requested an updated operating agreement and the latest capital injection logs for an entity called Oak Creek Holdings, LLC. The lender noted that the documents were required before the bank could authorize the next phase of construction financing. There were 4 PDF files attached to the message. My professional instincts completely overrode my hesitation. I opened the first attachment. It was the operating agreement for Oak Creek Holdings, LLC. I scrolled past the boilerplate legal definitions and went straight to the management structure on page 3. There were exactly 2 managing directors listed, Brenton Hayes and Richard Miller. My father and my brother-in-law owned a commercial real estate holding company. I opened the second document. It was a detailed balance sheet for the LLC. I started reading the numbers. This is where my brain takes over. Numbers are a clean language. They do not lie. They do not manipulate. They simply show you the path the money took. I scanned the incoming cash flows. I looked at the capital contribution logs tracking the money flowing into the project from external accounts. My eyes locked onto a recurring line item. A deposit for $4,000 recorded on the 3rd day of every single month. I tracked the dates back: January 3rd, February 3rd, March 3rd, December 3rd, November 3rd, every single month for 5 years. The deposits corresponded perfectly with the dates my bank processed my automatic wire transfers to my father's business account. He was not using my money to pay his warehouse vendors. He was not using my money to save his wholesale business from bankruptcy. His wholesale business was not failing at all. It was highly profitable. He was simply draining the revenue from his primary business to fund Oak Creek Holdings. And when that drained his operating capital, he used my $4,000 monthly bailouts to cover his warehouse overhead. He was using me to subsidize his daily operations so he could build a luxury commercial empire with Brent. I sat perfectly still in that expensive leather chair. The air conditioning kicked on, blowing cool air across my face, but I was already freezing. The financial data on the screen began to overlap with the reality of my daily life. I thought about the winter my heating unit broke down in my condo. I slept in a heavy winter coat under 3 blankets for a month because I had just wired my father $4,000 to save his warehouse lease. I could not afford the repair bill. I thought about my car. The mechanic had told me the transmission was failing and the vehicle was unsafe. I drove it anyway. I gripped the steering wheel in terror on the highway every morning because I had no cash for a down payment on a reliable vehicle. While I was risking my life in traffic to get to my desk job, Taylor was posting photos of her brand new imported SUV on social media. An SUV paid for by the distributions from Oak Creek Holdings. I had lived on cheap ramen noodles and instant coffee, so my sister could live in a luxury penthouse. I opened the third attachment. It was a promotional prospectus for the plaza. Glossy architectural renderings filled the screen. It was beautiful. High-end boutique storefronts, an artisan coffee shop with outdoor seating, a sprawling rooftop dining space. Brent and Taylor were not just building a basic strip mall, they were building a legacy property. And I was their unpaid, unknowing, silent investor. My father had stood by the grill 15 minutes ago and mocked my cheap clothes. He mocked my boring desk job. He used my financial struggles as a punchline to entertain his friends, but he had engineered those struggles. He had systematically drained my youth, my savings, and my peace of mind to elevate his favorite daughter. And now he was trying to force me to take out a $50,000 mortgage on my tiny condo, not to save the family name, not to prevent bankruptcy. He needed $50,000 because the bank was demanding a capital call on a $7 million project and he was short on liquid cash. He wanted me to leverage the only asset I owned so he could secure his real estate fortune. The cruelty of it was absolute. It was so profound that it bypassed grief entirely and landed straight into a sharp, crystalline clarity. I did not cry. I did not scream. Anger is a useless, noisy emotion when you are sitting on top of a gold mine of evidence. I leaned closer to the monitor. I opened an incognito browser tab and logged into my personal work email account. I created a new message. I downloaded every single PDF from Brent's inbox and attached them to my draft. The operating agreement, the balance sheets, the capital logs, the prospectus, the email threads confirming the project valuation. I sent the email directly to my secure corporate server. I waited for the green confirmation banner to appear at the top of the screen. Message sent. Then I went into the sent folder on Brent's email account. I permanently deleted the forwarded message. I emptied the trash folder. I closed the incognito tab. I left Brent's inbox looking exactly the way I had found it. I minimized the browser window. The desktop background appeared. Right in the center of the screen was the PDF file labeled Claire Loan Application. I did not open it. I did not print it. I stood up from the mahogany desk and pushed the heavy leather chair back into place. I smoothed the front of my discount store blouse. I took a deep breath, aligning my posture, ensuring my face showed absolutely nothing. I walked out of the study and down the hallway. The noise of the barbecue hit me the moment I stepped back out through the sliding glass door. The music was loud. People were laughing. The smell of smoked brisket hung heavy in the warm air. Richard was still standing near the grill, holding his tongs. Susan was right beside him. They both turned to look at me expectantly as I approached. They were waiting for me to hand over the paperwork. They were waiting for my surrender. I walked up to them holding nothing but my empty plastic cup. Richard frowned. His eyes darted to my empty hands. "Where's the application, Claire? I need that signed today, so I can take it to the bank tomorrow." I looked him right in the eyes. I kept my voice perfectly level and completely devoid of any emotion. "I need time to review the loan documents, Dad. I will not sign anything until I have a professional look at the terms." Richard flushed a deep, angry red. His jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to argue, to launch into another tirade about family loyalty and sacrifice. But someone called his name from the other side of the yard, demanding a fresh drink. I did not give him a chance to respond. I turned around and walked away from the patio. I walked down the driveway and got into my failing 8-year-old sedan. I put the key in the ignition and drove away from the party. Father's Day was exactly 3 weeks away. The countdown had officially begun. Monday morning arrived with a heavy gray overcast sky that perfectly matched the sterile fluorescent lighting of my corporate office. I was sitting at my desk by 6 in the morning. The massive glass building was completely silent. Most of the commercial analysts and loan officers would not arrive for another 2 hours. I have always preferred the quiet. It provides the necessary space to think without the constant hum of ringing telephones and frantic executives pacing the carpeted hallways. I sat down in my ergonomic chair and placed my travel mug of black coffee on the coaster. I did not turn on the overhead lights. The cool blue glow from my dual computer monitors was more than enough. I logged into our proprietary commercial real estate database. It is a highly restricted platform reserved for senior underwriters. It pulls raw data from county property records, municipal tax assessments, corporate registries, and state zoning boards. It maps out the hidden labyrinth of ownership that wealthy developers use to shield their assets from public view. I typed Oak Creek Holdings Limited Liability Company into the search bar. I pressed enter and watched the loading icon spin on the screen. My heart was beating with a slow, heavy, and deliberate rhythm. I was no longer the dutiful daughter, shrinking under my father's cruel insults at a backyard barbecue. I was a senior commercial underwriter, sitting at the control panel of my own professional domain. The database populated a list of search results. I clicked on the primary corporate filing. The names generated exactly as I had seen them on the email the day before. Richard Miller and Brenton Hayes were listed as the sole managing directors. They had registered the entity 3 years ago. That was right around the time my father claimed his wholesale supply business had suffered a catastrophic inventory loss, a tragedy that supposedly required me to double my monthly financial contributions. I opened a blank spreadsheet on my second monitor. I needed to build a precise timeline. I pulled up my personal banking history, going back 5 years. I exported the raw data and isolated every single wire transfer I had sent to my father's primary business account. $4,000 a month. $48,000 a year. $240,000 in total. I lined up those transfer dates next to the capital contribution logs I had forwarded to my secure server from Brent's email inbox. The alignment was flawless. It was an absolute masterpiece of financial abuse. My father would receive my $4,000 wire on the first day of the month. By the third day of the month, that exact amount was transferred out of his wholesale business and funneled into the Oak Creek operating account. It was meticulously labeled as an owner equity injection, but it was the corresponding expense column on the ledger that truly made my stomach turn. I cross-referenced the dates of those outgoing expenses with my own painful memories. I remembered the harsh winter 3 years ago when the heating unit completely broke down in my small condo. I slept in a heavy winter coat under 3 wool blankets for an entire month because I could not afford to call a repairman. I had wired my father an extra $2,000 that month because he told me he was going to miss payroll for his warehouse workers. I looked at the ledger for that specific week. Oak Creek Holdings had issued a check for exactly $2,000 to the Premier Country Club on the wealthy north side of town. It was to cover the initiation fee for Taylor and Brent. My sister was sipping champagne in a heated luxury clubhouse while I was shivering in my own living room. I scrolled further down the ledger. 2 years ago, I had experienced severe tooth pain that required an emergency root canal. A week before my dental appointment, my father called me in tears. He said the roof on his supply warehouse was caving in, and the inventory would be completely ruined if he did not pay a commercial contractor immediately. I canceled my dental procedure. I took painkillers for weeks and sent him the money. I sat at my kitchen table and cried from the physical pain. I looked at the corresponding date on the Oak Creek ledger. There was no warehouse roof repair. The funds had been transferred to a luxury auto dealership to cover the down payment on Brent's imported sports utility vehicle. Every single sacrifice I had made was neatly cataloged in their expense reports as a luxury upgrade. My chronic anxiety funded their arrogance. My instant ramen dinners funded their Wagyu steaks. I had willingly handed over my youth, my peace of mind, and my financial security because I believed with my entire heart that I was saving my parents from total ruin. I was not saving them. I was simply the unpaid, unknowing, silent sponsor of my sister's lavish lifestyle. My father had systematically weaponized my empathy and turned it into his own personal venture capital. I pushed the rising tide of anger aside. Anger is sloppy. Anger makes you miss the small, crucial details. I needed to find the weak point in their architectural structure. I turned my attention back to the commercial real estate database to examine the financing of the plaza itself. $7 million is a massive valuation for 2 men who have zero liquid cash and terrible personal credit histories. I needed to know how they secured the money to build a premium retail center. I pulled the mortgage records recorded with the county clerk. The primary construction loan was standard. A local commercial bank had provided $4 million based on the projected future value of the completed plaza, but $4 million was nowhere near enough to finish the high-end boutique storefronts and the sprawling rooftop dining space they had promised their prospective tenants. They had clearly faced a massive financial shortfall midway through the construction phase. I found the secondary financing document. It was recorded 9 months ago. My eyes scanned the terms, and I actually gasped out loud in the empty office. Richard and Brent had taken out $3 million in mezzanine debt through a ruthless private equity firm known entirely for its predatory lending practices. Mezzanine debt is essentially a high-interest bridge loan. Careless developers use it when traditional banks refuse to lend them any more money, but it comes with a massive, dangerous catch. Traditional mortgages are secured by the physical real estate. If you default, the bank has to drag you through a lengthy legal foreclosure process that can take years to resolve. Mezzanine debt is entirely different. It is not secured by the building itself. It is secured by the ownership shares of the limited liability company. I read the specific covenants hidden deep inside the 50-page loan agreement. The terms were brutally strict. The interest rate was exorbitant. But the most dangerous clause was buried in the default provisions. It was a strict foreclosure clause. If Oak Creek Holdings missed a single monthly payment by even 1 day, the private equity lender had the legal right to execute a rapid seizure of the company. They would not need to go to court to foreclose on the plaza. They would simply seize Richard and Brent's ownership shares, taking total control of the entire $7 million asset overnight. My father and my brother-in-law were playing a high-stakes game of financial roulette. They were sitting on a ticking time bomb of debt. The monthly payments on that mezzanine loan were staggering. The wholesale business revenue was barely covering the primary mortgage with the local bank. They were entirely dependent on my $4,000 monthly bailouts to scrape together enough cash to cover the mezzanine payment and keep the private equity firm at bay. My father was not just squeezing me for extra lifestyle cash. I was the only structural support, standing between him and total financial annihilation. I was the silent linchpin holding their entire luxury real estate empire together. I sat back in my ergonomic chair. The sun was finally rising, casting a pale golden morning light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corporate office. I could hear the faint sounds of my colleagues beginning to arrive, walking down the carpeted hallways and chatting softly about their weekend plans. My world had completely shattered and rebuilt itself in the span of 2 hours. I unlocked my smartphone. I opened my personal banking application. The interface loaded, displaying my modest checking account balance. I navigated to the Scheduled Transfers menu. There it was, the recurring automatic wire transfer, $4,000, scheduled to process automatically on the first day of the month. I stared at the glowing screen. I thought about the phone calls I would inevitably receive. I knew my mother would cry and weaponize her tears. I knew my father would shout and threaten to disown me. I knew Taylor would post passive-aggressive messages online about how money ruins families. For 5 long years, the paralyzing fear of those exact reactions had kept me completely trapped. I had been so terrified of losing my place in the family that I had willingly let them rob me blind. But looking at the screen now, I felt absolutely no fear. The heavy illusion was permanently broken. You cannot fear losing something you never truly had. They did not love me. They loved my compliance. They loved my endless financial utility. They loved the fact that I was too desperate for their approval to ever demand to see the receipts. I tapped the scheduled transfer. A prompt popped up on the screen asking if I wanted to edit or delete the recurring payment. I took a deep, slow breath. The air in the office felt incredibly clean and light. My hand was perfectly steady. My thumb hovered over the screen for a fraction of a second. Then I pressed delete. A green checkmark appeared confirming the cancellation. The payment was gone. The financial lifeline holding up Oak Creek Plaza was officially severed. I closed the banking application. I set my phone face down on the desk, picked up my coffee, and got back to work. 4 days. That is exactly how long it takes for a carefully constructed financial house of cards to register that a load-bearing wall has been removed. I spent those 4 days working, sleeping, and drinking my morning coffee with the strange, weightless peace of someone who has finally stopped trying to hold back the ocean. I knew the exact sequence of events unfolding in the background. The first of the month had come and gone. The automated clearinghouse system processed the regular transactions. The local bank checked my father's operating account for my usual $4,000 wire. Finding nothing, the system attempted to clear his outgoing vendor checks anyway. They bounced. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the middle of reviewing a zoning variance for a commercial client when my cell phone vibrated across my desk. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I did not silence it. I picked it up and answered on the third ring. "Claire, honey," Susan began. Her voice was breathless, pitched high with a frantic, fluttering energy. "Listen, I think there is a glitch with your bank. Your father went to run payroll and the transfer is not there. You need to call your branch right now and tell them to push it through manually. They are always messing things up." She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask if I had accidentally forgotten. She assumed absolute entitlement to the funds. The only logical explanation in her mind was a technical error because the idea that I would deliberately withhold their money was simply unfathomable to a woman who had trained me to comply. I kept my voice soft and perfectly flat. "There is no glitch, Mom. I canceled the transfer." The line went dead quiet. I could hear her breathing shift from frantic to suspended. "You did what?" "I canceled the transfer." I repeated, articulating every syllable with deliberate care. "I cannot cover it this month." "Claire, this is not funny." She snapped, the sugary sweetness vanishing instantly into something hard and sharp. "Your father has checks clearing tomorrow. If you do not push that money through, he is going to get hit with overdraft fees. You cannot just decide to be irresponsible out of nowhere. We depend on that money." "I cannot cover it," I said again. I did not offer an excuse. I did not mention my car repairs or my modest condo or my non-existent savings account. I knew from years of bitter experience that giving her a reason would only give her a problem to dismiss. A flat refusal leaves a manipulator with nothing to negotiate. "You are being ridiculous," Susan demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "Call the bank right now, Claire. Stop throwing a tantrum over whatever happened at the barbecue. We are a family." "Goodbye, Mom," I said, and I tapped the red button to end the call. I set the phone down on my desk. My heart was beating a little faster, but my hands were completely still. I had just said no to my mother for the first time in my adult life. The earth did not open up and swallow me. The sky did not fall. The only thing that happened was that my office remained perfectly quiet. But the quiet never lasts long with my family. Exactly 14 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time it was Richard. I answered it immediately. I wanted to hear him. I needed to hear the exact sound of a man who realizes his secret real estate empire is suddenly unfunded. "Claire," he said. He deployed his deep, soothing patriarch voice, the one he used to charm loan officers and church congregations. "Your mother is very upset. She said you are refusing to send the wire. Now I know you were embarrassed the other day, and I am sorry if my joke rubbed you the wrong way. But we are talking about the family business here. You need to stop playing games and send the money." He called his public humiliation of me a joke. He framed my financial boundaries as playing games. "I'm not playing games, Dad," I replied, leaning back in my ergonomic chair. "I am telling you the truth. I am not sending you $4,000. Not this month. Not ever again." The facade shattered completely. The soothing tone evaporated, replaced by a raw, venomous hostility that I had rarely heard directed at me. Usually I complied long before he had to unleash it. "You ungrateful little brat," Richard hissed into the receiver. "Do you have any idea what you are doing? You are going to put us on the street. You are going to force me into bankruptcy over a petty grudge. After everything I have sacrificed to put clothes on your back and food in your mouth, this is how you repay me, by stabbing me in the back when I am drowning." I listened to his fury. I listened to the specific words he chose to hurl at me. "You are going to put us on the street." I pictured the glossy architectural renderings of Oak Creek Plaza. I pictured the boutique storefronts and the sprawling rooftop dining space. I pictured the $3 million mezzanine loan and the strict foreclosure clause hidden deep in the default provisions. He was not terrified of losing his modest suburban home. He was absolutely panicked because the monthly payment on that predatory private equity loan was due in exactly 10 days. Without my $4,000 to artificially inflate his wholesale operating account, he was going to default on the plaza. He was staring down the barrel of losing a $7 million asset, and he was trying to bully me into saving it under the guise of family loyalty. "I am sorry your business is struggling, Dad," I said, infusing my voice with a detached corporate politeness, "but you will have to find another way to manage your cash flow. I am no longer available to finance your overhead." "If you do not wire that money by the end of business today, you are dead to me," Richard roared. His breathing was heavy, ragged, with genuine panic. "Do you hear me, Claire? You are completely cut off. Do not bother showing up for Thanksgiving. Do not bother calling your mother. If you ruin this family out of pure selfishness, you are no longer a part of it." He was threatening me with exactly what I had feared most for my entire life: being disowned, being cast out. For years, that threat had been the invisible leash that kept me running on their endless financial treadmill. But hearing it now, sitting in the absolute certainty of their massive real estate grift, the threat felt incredibly hollow. You cannot be exiled from a family that only ever viewed you as a line of credit. "I understand," I said calmly. "Have a good afternoon, Dad." I hung up before he could shout another word. I took a deep, cleansing breath. The severance was complete. The financial cord was cut, but I knew my family well enough to know that a direct assault was only their first tactic. When bullying fails, people like Richard and Susan pivot to public shaming. They operate like a political machine when they feel threatened. They control the narrative by being the first to broadcast it. The smear campaign began by the weekend. By Sunday morning, my phone started vibrating with messages from people I had not spoken to in months. My Aunt Barbara sent me a long, rambling text message at 7 in the morning. It read, "Claire, I am absolutely heartbroken to hear what you are doing to your parents. Your mother called me in tears last night. How can you sit in your fancy city apartment and watch them lose their livelihood? The Bible says to honor your father and mother. You need to make this right before you regret it." I read the message and deleted it without responding. Aunt Barbara had not remembered my birthday in 6 years, but she was fully prepared to lecture me on morality the moment Susan gave her the script. Then came the messages from the church members. A woman who ran the bake sale committee sent me a passive-aggressive note offering to pray for my hardened heart. A neighbor who played golf with my father texted me to say that family should always come before greed. My parents were selectively leaking a story of my sudden, cruel abandonment. They painted a picture of an arrogant, wealthy daughter who had turned her back on her humble, hardworking parents during their darkest hour. But the true masterpiece of emotional warfare came from my younger sister, Taylor. Taylor does not do direct confrontation. She prefers an audience. On Monday evening, my coworker forwarded me a screenshot of Taylor's latest public social media post. She had typed it out against a muted, sorrowful background for maximum dramatic effect. "It is incredibly painful when you realize that some people only care about themselves," Taylor wrote. "Watching my parents, who have given their entire lives to raising us, be abandoned by someone they loved is the hardest thing I have ever witnessed. Money changes people. It makes them cold and toxic. I am just so grateful to have a husband who understands that family is worth more than any dollar amount." Hold your true loved ones close today. I stared at the screenshot on my monitor. My sister, who is currently driving a luxury imported vehicle entirely funded by my stolen money, was calling me toxic and money-hungry. She was soaking up the sympathy of hundreds of local acquaintances, accepting their comforting comments and heart emojis, while blindly trusting her husband and my father to handle the messy business of extorting me. She truly believed her own victimhood. I felt a brief, intense flash of outrage. I wanted to post the commercial real estate documents right in her comment section. I wanted to upload the mezzanine loan agreement and tag every single church member who had texted me. I wanted to burn their pristine public image to the ground right then and there. But I stopped myself. I remembered the golden rule of commercial auditing. You never reveal your evidence during the preliminary investigation. You wait until the target is locked inside a room with no exits. You let them build their lies as high as possible, so the eventual collapse is absolute. They wanted me to react. They wanted me to engage in a messy, emotional social media war. They wanted me to look crazy bitter and unhinged. If I fought back online, I would just be a disgruntled daughter complaining about family dynamics. But if I stayed completely silent, their panic would continue to multiply in the dark. Because no matter how many sympathetic comments Taylor received on her post-social media likes, do not cover commercial loan payments. And the clock was ticking down rapidly. The private equity firm holding the debt on Oak Creek Plaza was not going to care about my father's reputation at the country club. They were not going to care about my mother's theatrical tears. They were going to demand their scheduled payment in less than 10 days. And Richard was completely out of options. I went to the local grocery store that night and bought myself a premium cut of steak. I cooked it in my small condo kitchen, listening to a jazz record and pouring myself a glass of red wine. I read through the hateful text messages as they trickled into my inbox, feeling a strange, profound sense of vindication with every single one. Every insult they hurled at me was just confirmation that my absence was financially suffocating their operation. I knew they were running out of time. I knew the phone calls and the proxy attacks were just the desperate flailing of a sinking ship. They had pushed me into a corner for my entire adult life, demanding that I shrink myself to fit their budget. Now they were trapped in a corner of their own making, and the walls were closing in on them fast. I finished my dinner. I washed my plate. I went to sleep with my phone on silent, fully prepared for whatever frantic tactic they would try next. I knew they would not simply accept defeat. The financial stakes were entirely too high. A $7 million plaza was slipping through their fingers. The proxy attacks were failing. The physical confrontation was coming next. The lobby of my corporate underwriting firm was a fortress of polished marble and acoustic glass. It was designed to intimidate. It was a space built for executives who managed hundreds of millions of dollars. Security guards in tailored suits monitored the turnstiles. The air always smelled faintly of expensive espresso and floor wax. I loved that lobby. It was the physical representation of the boundary between my chaotic family and the orderly professional life I had built for myself. I felt safe there. That safety was breached on a Wednesday morning at exactly 10:15. I was walking toward the ground floor cafe to grab an iced tea before a meeting with a commercial client. I held my tablet in one hand and my security badge in the other. I was reviewing a zoning addendum in my head. I was entirely focused on my job. Then I heard my name, Claire. The voice was loud. It echoed off the marble walls. I stopped and turned toward the visitor seating area. Brent was standing near a massive potted fern. My brother-in-law looked completely out of place in this pristine corporate environment. Usually he projected the image of a wealthy real estate developer. He usually wore tailored polo shirts and imported loafers. He usually carried himself with a slick and arrogant confidence. Today was different. The confidence was gone. He looked manic. His shirt was wrinkled. He was sweating heavily despite the aggressive air conditioning in the building. He was pacing back and forth and breathing through his mouth. The impending deadline on the private equity loan was clearly tearing him apart from the inside out. I did not walk toward him. I stood my ground near the security desk. I watched him march across the lobby toward me. He closed the distance fast. His body language was aggressive. He invaded my personal space, stopping less than 2 feet away. He loomed over me, trying to use his height to force me into submission. "What are you doing, Brent?" I asked. My voice was perfectly flat. I kept my volume low, forcing him to lean in to hear me. "You need to wire the money right now," he demanded. He did not say hello. He did not pretend to be friendly. His eyes were wide and frantic. His breath smelled like stale coffee and sheer panic. I looked at him. I looked at the dark circles under his eyes. I looked at the way his hands were clenching and unclenching at his sides. He was not here as a concerned family member. He was here as a desperate man watching his $7 million asset slip through his fingers. "I am working, Brent. "You cannot be here," I said calmly. "I am not leaving until you send the transfer," he hissed. He leaned closer. His voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "Richard is having a breakdown. Susan is crying all day. You are destroying your own family over some petty grudge. Pull out your phone and send the $4,000. Now." I took a slow breath. I did not step back. Stepping back would signal fear. I stood perfectly still. "You are trespassing in a secure commercial building. I am going to ask you to leave before I have security escort you out." Brent's face twisted into an ugly sneer. He thought he had leverage. He thought he could use my professional environment as a weapon against me. People like Brent always assume that a quiet woman in a corporate setting is terrified of a public scene. He was about to test that theory. "You are going to call security on me." He laughed. It was a harsh, grating sound. "Go ahead, Claire. Call them over. Let us get your bosses down here, too. I would love to meet them." He took another step forward. He was almost stepping on my shoes. "I will tell your entire management team exactly what kind of person you are," he threatened. "I will tell them you are financially abusing the elderly. I will tell them you are hoarding your money while your aging parents face eviction. How do you think your firm will react when they find out their senior underwriter is starving her own mother? You think they want someone with no morals handling their money? I will ruin your career right here in this lobby." I listened to his threat. I let the words hang in the space between us. He was trying to blackmail me into funding his luxury real estate project by threatening to accuse me of elder abuse. The irony was so profound, it almost made me smile. He and my father were the ones abusing my financial trust. They were the ones exploiting my empathy to build a retail plaza. I looked over his shoulder. A security guard named Marcus was already walking toward us. Marcus had been watching the interaction. He could see the aggressive posture. He could see that Brent did not have a visitor badge. "Is everything all right, Ms. Miller?" Marcus asked. He stopped a few feet away, keeping his hand near his radio. Brent puffed out his chest. He turned to the guard with a smug expression. "Everything is fine. I am her brother-in-law. We are just having a family discussion." I looked at Marcus. Then I looked back at Brent. The panic in Brent's eyes betrayed his confident posture. He was terrified that I would actually let security drag him out. He needed the money too badly to walk away empty-handed. I could have let Marcus throw him out into the street. I could have let him leave with his delusions intact. But I wanted Brent to understand exactly why the money had stopped. I wanted him to know that the game was permanently over. "It is fine, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice smooth and polite. "Give me one moment, please." Marcus nodded and stepped back, but he did not leave. He kept his eyes locked on Brent. I turned my full attention back to my brother-in-law. I stepped forward, closing the remaining distance between us. I looked directly into his eyes. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I spoke in a whisper so quiet that only he could hear the words. "How are the profit margins at Oak Creek Plaza looking this quarter, Brent?" The words were simple. They were spoken without any malice or venom, but they struck him with the force of a physical blow. I watched his entire reality crumble in a fraction of a second. The smug arrogance melted off his face instantly. His skin turned a sickening shade of pale gray. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His eyes widened in absolute horror as the realization hit him. He knew that I knew. He understood that the charade was completely destroyed. I did not just know about his hidden company. I knew the name of the project. I knew the exact corporate entity holding the debt. And if I knew the name of the plaza, I inevitably knew about the $3 million mezzanine loan hanging over his head. He stammered. His voice was breathless and weak. "You cannot." "I can," I whispered back. And I did. "I am not funding your luxury retail project, Brent. I am not covering the shortfall on your private equity loan. You and my father built a $7 million asset with my stolen savings. You are going to have to find another way to pay your creditors, because the Bank of Claire is permanently closed." He took a step backward. He stumbled slightly. He looked around the lobby as if the marble walls were suddenly closing in on him. He looked at Marcus, the security guard, who was still watching him with intense scrutiny. Brent was a coward. Bullies always are when you strip away their leverage. The moment he realized he had absolutely no power over me, his aggression turned into pure, unfiltered panic. If I exposed his scheme, he would not just lose my monthly funding. He would lose his reputation, his luxury vehicles, and his impending real estate fortune. He did not try to argue. He did not try to threaten my career again. He simply turned around and practically ran toward the revolving glass doors. He shoved his way through the exit and disappeared into the busy city street. I stood in the quiet marble lobby and took a deep, steadying breath. My hands were perfectly calm. My tablet was secure under my arm. The confrontation had lasted less than 5 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime of submission had finally been washed away. Marcus walked over to me. "Do you need me to file an incident report, Ms. Miller?" he asked kindly. "No, thank you," I replied, offering him a genuine smile. "He will not be coming back." I walked to the cafe and ordered my iced tea. I went upstairs and conducted my client meeting with total focus, but in the back of my mind, I was already calculating the next move. Brent was terrified. He was going to run straight back to my father. He was going to drive his imported SUV straight to Richard and tell him exactly what I had whispered in the lobby. The family now knew that I had discovered something about their financial secrets, but they did not realize the full extent of my knowledge. They probably thought I had merely stumbled across a bank statement or overheard a careless conversation. They had no idea that I had downloaded their operating agreements, their capital logs, and their strict foreclosure clauses. More importantly, they did not realize exactly how much power I actually held. They thought my only weapon was refusing to send the monthly $4,000 wire transfer. They thought they could still manage the fallout. Richard was a desperate man, and desperate men do not surrender quietly. He was going to pivot. He was going to abandon the private bullying tactics because they had clearly failed. He needed a strategy that would force me to comply against my will. He needed an audience. He needed a venue where I would be too paralyzed by social pressure to say no. I knew exactly what he was going to do next. Father's Day was approaching rapidly. It was only 2 weeks away. Richard loved holding court at the country club. He loved projecting the image of the benevolent, successful patriarch surrounded by his adoring family. He was going to use that upcoming holiday to trap me. He was going to orchestrate a public shaming at the Father's Day gala. He would try to humiliate me in front of the church elders, the wealthy neighbors, and his business associates. He would frame himself as the victim and demand a check in front of 50 witnesses, hoping I would break under the weight of public scrutiny. He was planning his final desperate play. He thought he was setting a trap for me. He had absolutely no idea that I was already building a financial guillotine of my own. I went back to my desk and opened the file on Oak Creek Holdings. The clock was ticking, and I had a debt to buy. A thick, cream-colored envelope arrived in my mailbox exactly 6 days after Brent fled from my corporate lobby. The return address belonged to the Oakmont Country Club. It was the most exclusive and expensive venue in our entire county. My father had been a member for a decade. He used the club strictly to project an illusion of vast wealth to his local business associates. I broke the gold wax seal and pulled out a heavy piece of cardstock. The cursive font announced a lavish Father's Day gala hosted by Richard Miller. At the very bottom, printed in bold black letters, was a line that made me stop breathing for a fraction of a second. It declared the special guest of honor to be his daughter, Claire Miller. It was a trap. It was not a peace offering or a genuine attempt at reconciliation. It was a carefully constructed public ambush. Richard knew that private bullying had completely failed. Brent's physical intimidation at my office had failed. Now my father was setting a stage with 50 pairs of eyes to force my absolute compliance. He was going to corner me in a room full of wealthy neighbors and influential church elders. He intended to use immense social pressure to extract the money I had recently denied him. 10 minutes after I opened the invitation, my personal cell phone rang. My mother was calling. I answered it immediately because I needed to hear the exact terms of their surrender demand. "Claire, I know you got the beautiful invitation," Susan said. Her voice was dripping with that heavy, artificial sweetness she exclusively used when other people were standing in the room with her. Your father has been under so much stress lately. His heart doctor is very concerned about his blood pressure. He is losing sleep over this silly little fight of yours." I did not correct her. I did not mention that the silly little fight was actually a $7 million real estate fraud scheme. I simply waited for the demand. "He wants to make things right," Susan continued. "He wants to honor you at the big dinner. All you have to do is show up and bring a check. We need $50,000, Claire. Put it in a nice envelope. Hand it to him when he makes his speech. Show everyone you are a good daughter who supports her family. Do that and all is forgiven. We can put this ugly business behind us forever." I listened to her lay out the blatant ransom note. She wanted me to bring a massive check to a public event. She wanted me to hand it over in front of a captive audience to purchase my way back into their good graces. They wanted to humiliate me while stealing my life savings. They wanted me to buy my own subjugation with a smile on my face. "I'll be there," I told her. My voice was perfectly smooth and completely void of any hesitation. "I will bring an envelope." Susan exhaled a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. "I knew you would come to your senses. Wear your nice navy dress, sweetheart. We want you looking presentable for the guests." She hung up the phone. She actually thought she had won the war. She thought the threat of public embarrassment had finally broken my spirit. She did not realize that public embarrassment is only an effective weapon if you actually have something to hide. I had absolutely nothing to hide. I did not cry. 5 years ago, I would have collapsed on my living room floor and wept until I was physically sick. I would have drained my retirement accounts just to please them and keep the peace. But the fragile woman who cried over their approval died the exact moment she saw those capital contribution logs on Brent's computer. The next morning, I walked into my corporate office 30 minutes early. I printed the entire Oak Creek Holdings file. I placed the operating agreements, the balance sheets, and the strict foreclosure clauses into a clean black binder. Then I walked past my own desk and went straight to the massive corner office belonging to my managing director. Victor Sterling was a 60-year-old commercial real estate veteran. He had built his massive fortune by being completely ruthless with predatory developers and fiercely loyal to his own underwriting team. Victor despised arrogant men like my father. He hated flashy builders who over-leveraged shell companies and expected the market to magically bail them out. He respected hard numbers, and he respected absolute loyalty. Victor was drinking espresso and reading the Financial Times when I knocked on his open door. He invited me in without looking up. I did not waste his valuable time with messy family drama or emotional apologies. I spoke to him purely as a senior underwriter presenting a distressed asset opportunity. "Victor," I said, sitting across from his heavy glass desk, "I have located a highly vulnerable commercial asset. It has a $7 million valuation and features premium retail construction. The managing directors are currently in a severe liquidity crisis. They are going to default on their secondary financing early next week." Victor lowered his newspaper. His sharp gray eyes locked onto mine. "What kind of secondary financing?" he asked. "It is a $3 million mezzanine loan held by a private equity firm," I replied. "It includes a strict foreclosure clause. The firm holding the debt is notorious for quick liquidations. They will want to offload the paper rather than manage the physical property completion. If we approach them right now, we can purchase the debt at a steep discount before the default officially hits the public record." Victor reached for the black binder I slid across his desk. He spent 10 minutes reading the operating agreements and the capital logs in complete silence. He looked at the names of the managing directors. He looked at my last name printed on my corporate badge. He put the pieces together without asking a single intrusive question. "This is your father's project," Victor stated. It was a simple fact, not a judgment. "Yes," I answered, keeping my posture perfectly straight. He and my sister's husband used my personal funds to subsidize their operational costs for 5 years. They are relying on my money to cover the massive mezzanine payment. I cut off their funding last week. They will miss the balloon payment in a few days. They will be in absolute default. I want to buy the debt." Victor steepled his fingers together and leaned back in his chair. "You want to become your father's primary creditor." "I want to own the plaza," I corrected him. "And I need the firm's silent backing to secure the purchase today." Victor studied me for a long time. He was evaluating my emotional stability. He needed to know that I would not flinch or show mercy when the time came to drop the financial blade. I held his gaze without blinking. I was completely empty of forgiveness. "Your credit is flawless," Victor finally said. "Your professional reputation in this building is unmatched. The firm will quietly back your play as a silent partner. We will provide the liquid capital you need to purchase the mezzanine note from the private equity lender. But the paper will be entirely in your name, Claire. You will hold the execution rights alone." The next 48 hours were a blur of intense legal and financial maneuvers. Victor introduced me to a specialized real estate attorney who handled aggressive corporate acquisitions. I liquidated my modest stock portfolio to cover the closing costs. I utilized my pristine credit score to leverage a commercial bridge loan backed entirely by Victor's firm. We approached the private equity lender holding the Oak Creek debt immediately. As I had predicted, the private equity firm had zero interest in foreclosing on a half-finished retail plaza. They were finance guys, not property managers. When my attorney offered to buy the mezzanine note at 90 cents on the dollar, they accepted the exit strategy without a second thought. The transaction was executed quietly and swiftly. The paperwork was signed digitized and recorded in secure corporate registries. Richard and Brent were never notified about the transaction because the legal transfer of debt ownership does not require the permission or knowledge of the original borrower. By Friday afternoon, I received a single encrypted email from my attorney. The attachment was a legal confirmation of assignment. The debt had been officially transferred. I sat at my desk and opened the document. I read my own name listed as the primary secured creditor for Oak Creek Holdings. My father had spent his entire life trying to make me feel small and insignificant. He had constantly reminded me that I was just a boring clerk with no vision or ambition. He believed he held all the power because he was loud and demanding. He never understood the most basic rule of wealth. The person who holds the debt is the person who holds the ultimate power. If Richard missed his payment next week, I had the absolute legal authority to execute the strict foreclosure clause. I could seize his corporate shares without a lengthy court battle. I could take total control of the $7 million plaza overnight. I could wipe out his entire real estate fortune with a single signature on a single piece of paper. I looked at the calendar sitting on my desk. The payment deadline for the mezzanine loan was quickly approaching. The Father's Day Gala at the exclusive country club was scheduled for the end of the week. My parents had planned their grand public ambush to take place right as they were destined to default on a loan they no longer realized I legally owned. They were throwing a lavish party on the deck of a sinking ship. My phone buzzed against the wooden surface of my desk. It was a text message from Taylor. I opened it and read the words she had typed with her usual arrogant entitlement. "Do not ruin Dad's special day on Sunday," she wrote. "Just bring the check and act normal. Do not embarrass us in front of his friends. We have a reputation to maintain." I read her condescending message and felt a genuine deep calm settle into my bones. The crippling anxiety that had plagued me for 5 long years was completely gone. I did not feel like a trapped victim anymore. I felt like an executioner who had just finished polishing the blade. My sister was demanding that I protect their reputation while they were actively trying to steal my home. She wanted me to play the role of the silent, obedient loser so she could continue pretending to be a wealthy socialite. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a heavy linen envelope. It was the exact same kind of expensive premium stationery my father used to project his fake wealth to the world. I did not put a $50,000 check inside. Instead, I placed the legal confirmation of the debt assignment and a blank notice of default into the envelope. I folded the documents carefully, ensuring the sharp edges aligned perfectly. I sealed the envelope with a firm press of my thumb. I picked up my phone to reply to my sister. I did not type out a long emotional paragraph defending my choices. I did not tell her how much pain they had caused me over the years. I simply matched her cold transactional energy with a promise I fully intended to keep. "I will bring an envelope," I typed back. "I promise he will never forget this Father's Day." I locked my phone and placed it into my purse. I looked out the large glass window of my office at the bustling city below. I had spent my entire adult life shrinking myself to make my family comfortable. I had accepted their insults and funded their delusions because I desperately wanted to belong to them. I had finally realized that belonging to them was a punishment, not a prize. I picked up the heavy linen envelope and slipped it carefully into my bag. I had a beautiful navy dress to pick out for a very important party. Midnight arrived on Thursday with absolutely no sound at all. There were no alarms and no warning sirens. The transition from Thursday to Friday happened quietly in the dark of my apartment. I sat on my sofa with a glass of water and watched the digital clock on my microwave flip to 12:01. That single minute marked the exact passing of the payment deadline. 3 days before the Grandfather's Day dinner, my father and my brother-in-law officially entered into default. The mezzanine loan payment was due by the close of business on Thursday. I knew they had missed it. I knew because I was the legal holder of the debt, and my attorney had already confirmed that the holding account remained completely empty. Richard and Brent had no liquid cash. They had spent the entire week focusing their energy on harassing me and designing a public ambush for Sunday. They assumed the private equity firm would grant them a standard grace period over the weekend. They believed they could extract $50,000 from my home equity on Sunday night and wire the funds on Monday morning with a polite apology for the delay. That is the fundamental danger of arrogance. Arrogant men believe the rules possess a certain elasticity when applied to them. They believe institutions will wait because they are accustomed to individuals waiting. My father treated commercial lenders the exact same way he treated me. He expected them to absorb his failures and adjust to his timeline. But commercial paper does not have a pulse. It does not feel guilt, and it does not grant unearned extensions. And most importantly, my father did not know that the faceless private equity firm he thought he was dealing with had already sold the paper. He was no longer dealing with an institution. He was dealing with a daughter who had stopped caring. On Friday morning, I took a cab to the financial district to meet with my legal counsel. My managing director had connected me with a man named Harrison Thorne. Harrison was a corporate real estate attorney who specialized in hostile acquisitions and aggressive asset recovery. He did not possess a warm personality. His office was a stark minimalist space constructed of glass and gray steel. He did not offer me coffee or engage in casual small talk. He simply placed a thick stack of legal documents onto his polished marble desk and looked at me with cold professional respect. They missed the midnight deadline, Harrison stated, pointing to the top document. The default is absolute. There is no cure period written into this specific contract. Your brother-in-law signed an exceptionally dangerous piece of paper. I sat across from him and examined the printed contract. Brent had been so desperate to secure the final $3 million to finish his luxury plaza that he had agreed to incredibly predatory terms. Traditional commercial mortgages are secured by the physical dirt and the physical building. If a borrower defaults on a traditional mortgage, the bank must initiate a public foreclosure process through the court system. That process can drag on for years, allowing the borrower time to file for bankruptcy and stall the seizure. But Brent did not sign a traditional mortgage. He signed for mezzanine debt. Harrison carefully explained the lethal mechanics of the trap Brent had walked into. Mezzanine debt is governed by the Uniform Commercial Code. It is not secured by the real estate itself. It is secured by the actual ownership shares of the limited liability company that owns the real estate. Oak Creek Holdings, LLC owned the plaza. Richard and Brent owned the shares of the LLC. By defaulting on the mezzanine loan, they triggered a specific mechanism known as strict foreclosure. Harrison tapped his expensive pen against the paperwork. Under these provisions, you do not need to take them to court to seize the physical property. You simply absorb their ownership shares. As the secured creditor, you execute a strict foreclosure on the equity interests. You instantly become the sole managing member of Oak Creek Holdings. You take the keys to the entire corporate entity, and the $7 million plaza comes with it. I listened to the clean, devastating logic of the law. Brent had essentially handed over the deed to his own castle, assuming he would never actually have to surrender it. He was blinded by his own vanity. He wanted the prestige of developing a premium commercial asset so badly that he gambled his entire ownership stake on the assumption that I would always be available to bail him out. He built his entire business model on the reliability of my compliance. "We are executing the strict foreclosure today," Harrison confirmed, sliding a sleek document toward me. "This is the notice of foreclosure and the formal transfer of membership interests. It strips Richard Miller and Brenton Hayes of all equity and management authority in Oak Creek Holdings, LLC. Effective immediately, they own absolutely nothing. You are the sole legal proprietor." I picked up the heavy black pen, resting on the marble desk. My hand did not shake. I felt a profound quiet settle over my mind. For 5 years, I had signed my name to wire transfers and grocery bills and car repairs to keep my father afloat. I had signed away my own youth. I pressed the tip of the pen to the signature line and signed my name one final time. The ink flowed smoothly across the page. The transfer was complete. I spent Friday evening sitting at my small dining table, preparing the final pieces of the presentation. I did not want to simply hand my father a legal document. A foreclosure notice only explained the consequence of his actions. I needed him to understand the exact anatomy of his betrayal. I wanted the entire extended family to see the absolute truth of what he had done to me. I needed to build a mirror so clear and so bright that no one could ever dispute the reflection. I opened my laptop and loaded the forensic spreadsheet I had built earlier in the week. I spent 3 hours formatting the document. I wanted it to read like a professional corporate audit. I adjusted the margins and bolded the headers. I created 3 distinct columns. The first column detailed the exact dates and amounts of every single wire transfer I had sent to his wholesale business over the last 5 years. I listed the month I had postponed my dental surgery. I listed the winter I had lived without heat. I documented the 60 individual payments of $4,000. The total at the bottom of the first column was $240,000. The second column revealed the immediate corresponding transfers out of his business account and into the Oak Creek Holdings account. This demonstrated the deliberate laundering of my money. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that my father was never on the brink of bankruptcy. He was systematically washing my hard-earned salary through his corporate ledger to fund his private real estate ambitions. But the third column was the true masterpiece. The third column tracked the exact luxury expenses drawn from the Oak Creek account immediately following my deposits. I matched the dates with surgical precision. I listed the initiation fees for the exclusive country club. I listed the down payment for the imported sports utility vehicle. I documented the expensive vacations, the designer clothing, and the lavish dinners. I provided a meticulous, itemized receipt of my sister's incredibly expensive lifestyle. I printed the spreadsheet on heavy premium paper. The printer hummed softly in the quiet of my living room. I took the pages and reviewed them one last time. The numbers were irrefutable. They bypassed emotion and delivered pure, factual reality. Anyone who looked at this document would instantly understand that my father had treated my life as a disposable funding source for his favorite child. I walked into my bedroom and retrieved a thick linen envelope from my desk drawer. It was the same elegant, cream-colored stationery I had purchased earlier in the week. The texture of the paper was rough and expensive. It was the exact type of envelope a wealthy patriarch would expect to receive at a formal country club gala. I took the notice of strict foreclosure provided by my attorney. I placed it at the very back of the stack. I took the formal transfer of membership interests, which legally removed Richard and Brent from the company, and placed it next. Then, I took the 3-page forensic spreadsheet and placed it right at the front. I folded the heavy documents with deliberate care. I pressed my thumb along the crease, ensuring the edges aligned perfectly. I slipped the thick stack of paper into the cream linen envelope. It felt substantial in my hands. It carried a physical weight. My father was expecting to open this envelope on Sunday evening and find a cashier check for $50,000. He was expecting the ultimate symbol of my total submission. He believed I would hand over the equity in my small condo to preserve his fragile ego in front of his wealthy peers. Instead, this envelope contained the absolute destruction of his financial empire. It contained the undeniable proof of his exploitation. It held the legal transfer of his $7 million asset directly into my name. I did not seal the envelope. I left the flap open so he could pull the documents out easily when he stood at the head of the table. I wanted the delivery to be seamless. I placed the envelope on the kitchen counter, right next to my keys. I walked into my bedroom and looked at the navy blue dress hanging on the closet door. My mother had specifically requested that I wear it, so I would look presentable for their guests. I fully intended to honor her request. I wanted to look my absolute best when I finally balanced the ledger. I lay in the dark and allowed myself to think about my mother, Susan. For years, I had blamed my father for the financial abuse, while viewing my mother as a passive participant. I had convinced myself that she simply did not understand the mechanics of what he was doing. But the spreadsheet resting on my kitchen counter proved otherwise. Susan knew exactly how the money moved. She was the one who orchestrated the emotional manipulation. Whenever I hesitated to send a wire, she was the one who manufactured the tears. She was the one who weaponized the concept of family loyalty. She was the psychological enforcer of the grift. And then there was Taylor. My younger sister had coasted through her entire life, completely insulated from consequence. She married a man who promised her a life of luxury, and when that man fell short, she willingly allowed my parents to cannibalize my future to make up the difference. Taylor believed she was inherently deserving of the penthouse, the imported car, and the country club memberships. She viewed my financial struggles as a personal failing on my part, rather than the direct result of her own greed. She truly believed I was just a boring clerk with no ambition while she was destined for greatness. They had all played their parts flawlessly. They had built an entire ecosystem of exploitation designed to keep me trapped at the very bottom. They needed me to be insecure. They needed me to be lonely. They needed me to believe that my only value to the world was my ability to provide them with cash. If I ever found my own strength, their entire structure would instantly collapse. I closed my eyes and listened to the distant sound of city traffic outside my window. The financial execution I had prepared was not just about recovering my stolen funds. It was about fundamentally destroying the false narrative they had built around my identity. I was not going to simply take their plaza and walk away. I was going to force them to look at the truth of who they were in front of the exact audience they valued most. They had chosen the venue. They had invited the guests. They had set the stage for their own public ruin. The heavy cream envelope sitting on my counter was not a weapon. It was an invoice for 5 years of stolen life, and I was finally ready to collect. Saturday evening settled over my modest neighborhood with a thick and suffocating stillness. The streetlights outside my window cast long shadows across the walls of my living room. I stood in my kitchen with a glass of tap water and watched the city skyline flicker in the distance. The apartment was completely silent. I had spent the last 5 years filling the silence of my home with frantic calculations and desperate budget adjustments. I used to pace these very floors at 2 a.m. while trying to figure out how to stretch a bag of rice and a box of oatmeal until my next paycheck. Tonight, the silence was entirely different. It was not the agonizing quiet of a cornered animal. It was the absolute tranquility of a hunter waiting for the sun to rise. My cell phone buzzed against the granite countertop. The sudden vibration shattered the stillness. The glowing screen illuminated the dark kitchen. I did not immediately reach for the device. I knew who was trying to contact me. The proxy attacks had been intensifying all week. My mother had deployed every relative and church acquaintance she could manipulate. I took a slow sip of water and walked over to the counter. I picked up the phone and looked at the notification banner. The message was from Taylor. My younger sister had apparently decided to descend from her ivory tower to deliver a final royal decree. I swiped the screen to open the message thread. The text was brief and utterly devoid of any basic human decency. "Do not ruin Dad's special day tomorrow," Taylor had typed. "Just bring the check and act normal." Pay what you owe us and stop throwing a selfish tantrum. I read the words 3 times. Pay what you owe us. The sheer psychological audacity of that specific phrasing fascinated me. My sister was not asking for a favor. She was demanding the payment of a fabricated debt. In her twisted and carefully curated reality, I was not the victim of a massive financial extortion scheme. I was a hoarding and ungrateful spinster who was unfairly withholding the family inheritance. Taylor had lived a completely subsidized existence for so long that she viewed my personal salary as her inherent birthright. She genuinely believed that my money belonged to the collective family trust and that my refusal to hand over $50,000 was an act of malicious theft. She wanted me to act normal. Acting normal in my family meant sitting quietly at the end of the table while Richard belittled my career. Acting normal meant smiling politely while Susan praised Taylor's imported vehicle and expensive vacations. Acting normal meant absorbing all the anxiety, all the financial terror, and all the suffocating shame so they could comfortably pretend to be suburban royalty. I did not type a response. Any reply would have been a waste of energy. I simply locked the screen and placed the phone face down on the counter. The time for negotiating with delusions had permanently passed. I turned my attention to the heavy linen envelope resting next to my keys. The cream-colored paper looked elegant and unassuming. It was the exact type of premium stationery my father used to send out his ostentatious gala invitations. It looked like it should contain a generous monetary gift or a heartfelt letter of appreciation. It did not. It contained a notice of strict foreclosure. It contained a legally binding transfer of membership interests. It contained a highly detailed forensic accounting spreadsheet that mapped out every single dollar they had stolen from me over the last 60 months. I reached out and ran my fingertips over the sharp edges of the envelope. The paper possessed a distinct physical gravity. It held the entire weight of my stolen youth. I remained standing in the dim kitchen and allowed my mind to travel backward through time. I thought about the staggering accumulation of sacrifices I had made to keep my father afloat. I thought about my 30th birthday. I had spent 3 years saving a tiny portion of my entry-level salary in a hidden digital envelope. I wanted to take a solo trip to Italy to walk through the ancient streets of Rome and drink wine on the Amalfi Coast. It was the only dream I had allowed myself to harbor. 2 weeks before I was supposed to book the flight, my father had called me, weeping uncontrollably. He claimed a vital shipping container had been lost at sea, and his wholesale business would completely collapse if he did not wire an emergency vendor payment. I emptied the digital envelope that same afternoon. I spent my 30th birthday sitting in a cubicle, eating a stale sandwich, and staring at a spreadsheet while my heart physically ached. I thought about the physical toll the financial stress had exacted on my body. I thought about the chronic insomnia that kept me awake staring at the ceiling and praying for a miracle. I thought about the dull, throbbing pain in my jaw from grinding my teeth every single night. I remembered the sheer terror of driving my failing 8-year-old sedan down the highway while praying the transmission would hold together for just 1 more month. I had neglected my own health, my own joy, and my own basic comfort because I believed I was the only barrier standing between my parents and total destitution. They had weaponized my compassion. They had looked at my loving heart and seen nothing but a limitless line of credit. As I stared at the envelope, I realized something profound and deeply liberating. I was completely empty of grief. I felt absolutely no sorrow over the impending destruction of my family. Society conditions us to believe that cutting off your parents is a tragedy that must be accompanied by endless weeping and agonizing guilt. But the truth was, I had already completed my mourning process. I had mourned the loss of my parents years ago when I finally accepted that they would never love me the way they loved Taylor. I had grieved the father who never asked about my day and the mother who only called when the bills were due. The people gathering at the country club tomorrow were not my family. They were simply strangers who shared my genetic material and exploited my bank account. The paralyzing grief was completely gone. What remained in its place was the cold and satisfying precision of a perfectly balanced ledger. I'm a commercial underwriter. My entire professional existence is dedicated to uncovering fraud and assigning liability. My father had presented me with fraudulent emotional invoices for half a decade. Tomorrow evening, I was going to close the account. I was going to collect the outstanding principal with absolute and ruthless efficiency. Sunday arrived with a thick and oppressive summer heat that settled over the city like a wet towel. I spent the early afternoon moving through my apartment with deliberate and methodical slowness. I did not rush. I performed every task with the focused intention of a soldier preparing for a decisive battle. I walked into my bedroom and took the navy blue dress out of the closet. My mother had specifically instructed me to wear it so I would look presentable for their wealthy friends. I stepped into the dress and smoothed the fabric over my hips. The dark material was conservative and exceptionally tailored. It was the exact armor required for a corporate execution. I applied my makeup with a light hand. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, polished knot at the nape of my neck. I looked into the full-length mirror and studied my own reflection. I did not look like the timid and exhausted daughter they were expecting to ambush. I looked like a senior executive preparing to liquidate a distressed asset. I picked up my purse. I carefully placed the heavy cream envelope inside, ensuring the corners would not bend or crease. I grabbed my car keys and walked out the door, locking it firmly behind me. The drive to the Oakmont Country Club took exactly 45 minutes. The journey was a physical manifestation of the massive wealth gap between my actual reality and my father's carefully constructed illusion. I navigated my aging sedan out of my modest working-class neighborhood. The cracked asphalt and the crowded apartment complexes slowly gave way to wider roads and cleaner sidewalks. As I approached the affluent northern suburbs, the landscape shifted dramatically. The trees grew taller and thicker, forming massive green canopies over the pristine avenues. The houses transformed from standard suburban builds into sprawling gated estates with manicured lawns and private tennis courts. My father did not live in this neighborhood, but he spent all of his stolen money attempting to convince the people who did live here that he belonged among them. I turned my car onto the sweeping private drive that led to the country club. The entrance was flanked by towering stone pillars and immaculate flower beds, bursting with summer blooms. The main clubhouse sat at the top of a gentle hill. It was a massive structure, built of pale stone and rich mahogany wood, designed to project an aura of impenetrable old money. I pulled my 8-year-old sedan into the circular drop-off zone. I found myself positioned between a brand new imported sports car and a sleek black limousine. The valet stepped forward. He was a young man in a crisp white uniform, and he could not completely mask the brief flicker of confusion that crossed his face when he saw the peeling paint on my hood. I handed him my keys with a polite smile. I did not feel the crushing embarrassment that usually accompanied my vehicle. The peeling paint was no longer a symbol of my failure. It was the undeniable proof of their financial crimes. I turned away from the driveway and walked toward the ornate double doors of the main entrance. The heavy brass handles were polished to a brilliant shine. A uniformed attendant pulled the door open for me, offering a deferential nod. I stepped over the threshold, and the oppressive summer heat was instantly replaced by hyper-air-conditioned coolness. The lobby of the Oakmont Country Club smelled of expensive floral arrangements, roasted meats, and wealth. The floors were covered in thick Persian rugs that absorbed the sound of my footsteps. A classical jazz trio was playing softly in the corner of the adjacent lounge, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to the evening. Groups of wealthy patrons stood in small clusters, holding crystal glasses of champagne and discussing their investment portfolios. The women wore designer silk dresses and expensive jewelry. The men wore tailored summer suits and luxury watches. This was the exact audience my father had assembled to witness my ultimate humiliation. He wanted these people to watch me hand over a massive check to save his fake empire. He wanted to use their sheer social weight to crush any remaining resistance in my spirit. I approached the main reception desk. The hostess was a polished older woman holding a leather-bound reservation book. She smiled a practiced and flawless smile. "Good evening, madam. Are you attending a private event tonight?" she asked. "Yes," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly smooth and pleasant. I am here for the Father's Day Gala hosted by Richard Miller. I believe I am listed as the guest of honor. The hostess ran her manicured finger down the list of names in her leather book. Ah, yes, Miss Claire Miller. The Miller party is located in the Grand Magnolia dining room. It is right down this main corridor and through the double doors at the very end. They are expecting you. Thank you, I said. I adjusted the strap of my purse on my shoulder. I could feel the solid weight of the linen envelope resting against my side. My heart was beating with a slow and steady rhythm. There was no flutter of anxiety in my chest. There was no desperate urge to turn around and flee back to the safety of my apartment. I felt an absolute and terrifying calm radiating through my entire body. My family believed they had cornered a frightened animal. They thought they had designed a trap so flawless and so public that I would have absolutely no choice but to surrender my entire financial future to them. They were waiting in the Grand Magnolia dining room, convinced of their own inevitable victory. They did not realize that the frightened animal they had abused for 5 years was completely gone. I was not walking into their trap. I was the trap. The financial guillotine was already built, the blade was already sharpened, and the rope was securely in my hand. I took a deep breath of the cool, perfumed air and began walking down the long corridor to deliver the final reckoning. The heavy oak doors of the Grand Magnolia dining room swung open to reveal a space completely dripping in manufactured prestige. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over 5 large circular tables and 1 massive head table draped in pristine white linen. I stepped quietly onto the thick woven carpet and allowed my eyes to sweep across the room. There were exactly 50 guests seated in the expansive hall. My father had spared absolutely no expense for his grand theatrical production. He had gathered the most influential figures in his carefully curated social circle. The senior elders from his church were clustered near the front window sipping sparkling cider. Wealthy local business owners, wearing custom-tailored suits, were deep in conversation with my extended family members. Waiters in crisp black vests navigated the narrow spaces between the chairs, carrying silver trays loaded with colossal shrimp cocktails and artisan breads. The sheer financial audacity of the scene was staggering. I stood near the entrance and mentally calculated the running total of the evening. The venue rental alone in the peak of the summer season was astronomical. The floral centerpieces bursting with fresh white roses and imported hydrangeas adorned every single table. The waitstaff was already pouring a vintage Cabernet Sauvignon into towering crystal glasses. My father was currently in a state of catastrophic default. He did not possess the liquid capital to pay a plumber, let alone fund a private gala at the most exclusive country club in the county. He had likely maxed out his very last remaining line of credit to secure this reservation. He was bleeding out financially, but he had purchased one final night of illusion to convince 50 important people that he was still a titan of industry. And he had purchased this illusion specifically to trap me. I walked toward the head table with my posture completely straight and my face entirely devoid of emotion. My mother saw me first. Susan was wearing an emerald green silk dress that draped perfectly over her shoulders. She immediately put on her flawless society smile and waved me over with a frantic, fluttering motion of her hand. She had strategically reserved the seat directly to her right. It was a position of supposed honor, but it was actually a holding cell. It placed me directly in the center of the audience and squarely in the direct line of sight of my father, who sat at the very head of the long table. I took my designated seat and placed my small clutch purse in my lap. I could feel the heavy linen envelope resting securely inside the leather bag. My sister Taylor was sitting directly across from me. She wore a diamond tennis bracelet and a smug expression. She leaned over and offered me a tight, insincere smile. She genuinely believed I had surrendered. She thought I was sitting there with a massive check, ready to beg for their forgiveness. Beside her sat Brent. My brother-in-law did not look smug. He looked physically ill. His complexion was ashen, and he was drinking his wine much too fast. Brent knew exactly what I had whispered to him in my corporate lobby. He knew I had uncovered the shell company. but he clearly believed that my father had successfully bullied me into funding the shortfall anyway. Brent kept wiping his damp palms on his expensive trousers, completely terrified, but clinging to the false hope of my submission. No one at the head table spoke to me about the money. They engaged in loud, aggressive small talk about the summer weather and upcoming vacation plans. They performed their roles for the surrounding guests, projecting an image of total familial harmony. I participated in the charade. I answered their shallow questions with polite, brief responses. I drank my iced water and watched them perform their desperate play. The main course arrived shortly after I took my seat. The country club kitchen had prepared thick cuts of prime filet mignon, paired with truffle-whipped potatoes and roasted asparagus. The rich, savory aroma of the expensive steaks filled the dining room. I picked up my heavy silver fork and calmly ate my meal. The meat was tender and cooked perfectly. I actually found myself enjoying the food. A bizarre and profound peace had settled over my entire nervous system. I was surrounded by people who viewed me as nothing more than a disposable asset, but I was completely immune to their judgment. The conversations at the adjacent tables drifted over to my seat. I listened to a local construction magnate complain about property taxes. I heard the head pastor of my parents' church praising my father for his incredible generosity and his steadfast commitment to the community. My father sat at the head of the table, soaking up the admiration. He laughed loudly and nodded his head, playing the part of the humble patriarch. He looked incredibly satisfied. He had successfully gathered his entire social ecosystem into one room. He had established his dominance. He believed he had successfully cornered his rebellious daughter and forced her back into her rightful place at the bottom of the hierarchy. As the waitstaff cleared the dinner plates and began pouring fresh cups of dark roast coffee, the ambient noise in the room began to shift. A collective sense of anticipation rippled through the 50 guests. They all knew this was a Father's Day celebration, and they were expecting a speech. My father thrived on an audience. He thrived on the sound of his own voice echoing across a quiet room. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and slowly pushed his chair back from the table. Richard reached for his crystal water goblet and tapped the side of the glass with his silver butter knife. The clear ringing sound cut through the low hum of conversation. The entire Grand Magnolia dining room immediately fell silent. 50 faces turned toward the head table. Waiters stopped moving. Susan placed her hand over her heart and beamed at her husband. Taylor leaned forward with an expression of manufactured adoration. Brent stared at the tablecloth, sweating profusely. My father stood up. He adjusted the lapels of his custom suit jacket. He looked out over the crowd with a deeply practiced expression of gentle humility. He allowed the silence to stretch for a few seconds, ensuring he had captured the absolute attention of every single person in the room. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Richard began. His voice was rich and resonant, filling the expansive hall with effortless authority. Standing in this room, looking at the faces of my oldest friends, my respected colleagues, and my beloved church family, I am reminded of how truly blessed I am. Father's Day is not just a holiday for me, it is a moment of deep reflection. It is a time to look back at the long, difficult road we have traveled to build a life of meaning and purpose. He paused and offered a warm, nostalgic smile. He launched into a masterful monologue about his humble beginnings. He spun a fabricated narrative about starting his wholesale business from nothing, working endless hours in a freezing warehouse to provide a better life for his children. He painted himself as a tireless provider, a man who had sacrificed his own dreams to ensure his family never wanted for anything. The guests listened with rapt attention. A few of the older women nodded in sympathetic agreement. But being a father is not just about providing financial security. Richard continued, his voice dropping to a softer, more intimate register. It is about instilling values. It is about teaching your children the meaning of loyalty. Family is the only thing we truly have in this world. It is the foundation of our entire society. When the storms of life hit, and believe me, we all face storms, it is the family unit that keeps us from drowning. He was laying the groundwork. He was building the thematic architecture for the public execution he was about to perform. I sat perfectly still, with my hands folded in my lap, and watched him work the room. He was incredibly skilled at emotional manipulation. The warm, nostalgic tone of his speech slowly began to curdle. A heavy, sorrowful note crept into his voice. He lowered his gaze to the tablecloth, adopting the posture of a wounded martyr. He sighed a long, dramatic breath that amplified through the silent dining hall. But parenting also brings a unique kind of pain. He said, his voice cracking with a manufactured vulnerability. It is a pain that many of you in this room might unfortunately recognize. We give everything to our children. We pour our blood and sweat into their futures. And sometimes, despite our best efforts, they lose their way. They get blinded by the modern world. They become consumed by greed and selfishness. And there is nothing more agonizing for a father than watching a child you raised turn their back on the very people who gave them life. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The comfortable, celebratory mood vanished, replaced by a tense, uncomfortable silence. The guests shifted awkwardly in their padded chairs. They knew Richard was no longer speaking in generalities. He was addressing a specific grievance. He lifted his head. He turned his body slightly and locked his sharp, cold eyes directly onto me. 50 pairs of eyes followed his gaze. The entire room turned their collective attention to the quiet woman sitting in the navy blue dress at the right side of the head table. The silence became absolute and suffocating. It was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning unit running through the ceiling vents. Richard did not break eye contact. The sorrowful martyr vanished. A cruel, condescending smile slowly spread across his face. It was the smile of a man who believed he had just checkmated his opponent in front of the entire world. "But I know my Claire," he announced, projecting his voice so every single syllable reached the back of the room. "I know she has a good heart, buried under all those numbers and spreadsheets. I know she has been struggling with some selfish decisions lately, but I also know she would never let her old man drown when things get tough." He took a step away from his chair and gestured toward me with an open palm. He was inviting the audience to witness my total submission. "I know she brought something tonight to make things right," he declared, his tone dripping with mock affection and absolute dominance. "I know she came here to prove that she finally understands the meaning of family loyalty. So go ahead, sweetheart. Do not be shy. Open your little envelope, Claire. Let us show everyone here what kind of daughter you really are." The room waited. The air was thick with expectation and judgment. My mother leaned toward me, her eyes wide and demanding. Taylor smirked from across the table, her arms crossed in victory. My father stood at the head of the room, radiating absolute triumph. They had cornered me. They had applied the maximum amount of public pressure possible. They fully expected me to reach into my purse, pull out a $50,000 check, and hand over my entire financial future to buy their superficial approval. They expected me to shrink. They expected me to surrender. I looked at my father. I looked at the cruel, confident smile plastered across his face. I reached down and opened the clasp of my small leather purse. My fingers brushed against the heavy linen envelope. I grasped the thick cream-colored paper and slowly pulled it out into the bright chandelier light. I did not rush. I placed my hands flat against the thick white tablecloth and pushed my chair backward. The wooden legs scraped against the carpet with a dull and heavy thud. It was a mundane sound, but in the suffocating quiet of the Grand Magnolia dining room, it commanded absolute attention. I stood up to my full height. I picked up the heavy, cream-colored linen envelope from the table. I held it securely in my right hand. 50 pairs of eyes locked onto my every movement. The wealthy neighbors and the church elders leaned forward in their padded chairs. They were entirely captivated by the theatrical production my father had meticulously orchestrated. They fully expected to witness a tearful reconciliation. They anticipated seeing a rebellious and misguided daughter humbly submit to the righteous authority of a benevolent patriarch. I could feel the suffocating weight of their collective judgment pressing down on my shoulders. It was the exact same social pressure that had kept me paralyzed and compliant for my entire adult life. But as I took my first step away from my seat, I realized that the crushing weight was completely gone. I felt lighter than air. I began the long walk toward the head of the table. The distance was perhaps 20 feet, but I traversed it with the deliberate and unhurried pacing of a woman who owns the very ground beneath her shoes. I looked at the faces of my family as I passed them. My mother, Susan, was practically glowing with manufactured triumph. Her posture was relaxed, and her eyes were bright with the intoxicating thrill of absolute victory. My sister Taylor was staring at her phone, looking incredibly bored by the entire proceeding. She simply wanted me to hand over the money so she could return to her life of uninterrupted luxury. I reached the head of the table. My father, Richard, was waiting for me. He stood tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a custom-tailored suit purchased with the last fragments of his crumbling credit. He offered me a warm and forgiving smile that was entirely designed for the audience watching us. He extended his right hand across the pristine white linen. His palm was open and waiting. He expected me to place a thin, rectangular slip of paper into his hand. He expected a cashier's check for $50,000 drawn against the equity of my modest condominium. I did not place the envelope in his hand. I set the thick, heavy package directly onto the table, just beyond his reach. I slid it across the smooth fabric until it came to a halt, directly in front of his empty crystal wine glass. Richard looked down at the envelope. A brief flicker of confusion crossed his features. The package was much too thick to contain a single check. It possessed the unmistakable physical gravity of a dense legal dossier. He looked up at me, his patronizing smile faltering for a fraction of a second. I offered him no reassurance. I simply stood across from him with my hands resting loosely at my sides, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. He picked up the linen envelope. The thick paper rustled loudly in the dead silence of the room. He slid his index finger under the unsealed flap and pulled out the stack of documents. I watched his eyes as they scanned the top page. I watched his brain attempt to process a reality that completely defied his arrogant expectations. The document resting in his hands was not a bank check. It was a formal legal notice printed on heavy corporate letterhead. His eyes tracked across the bold black letters printed at the very top of the page. Notice of strict foreclosure. He blinked rapidly. He physically shook his head slightly, as if trying to clear a sudden fog from his vision. He looked at the second line of text. Oak Creek Holdings Limited Liability Company. The blood drained from his face with terrifying speed. The healthy flush of the triumphant patriarch vanished entirely, replaced by a sickly, ashen gray. His jaw slackened. His hands began to tremble so violently that the crisp edges of the legal documents vibrated against each other. He was staring at the absolute destruction of his secret real estate empire, but his mind was violently rejecting the information. He could not comprehend how the quiet and compliant daughter he had relentlessly bullied could possibly possess a commercial foreclosure notice bearing the name of his hidden shell company. I did not give him time to recover his composure. I did not allow him to spin a new narrative or hide the documents from the audience. I spoke. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout or scream or let a single ounce of anger bleed into my tone. I spoke with the crisp, authoritative, and perfectly level cadence of a senior commercial underwriter, delivering a final financial verdict. The acoustics of the grand dining hall carried my voice perfectly to every single guest. "I brought exactly what I owe you, Dad," I announced. The silence in the room deepened. The guests exchanged confused glances. This was not the tearful apology they had been promised. I bought the mezzanine debt on Oak Creek Holdings. I stated clearly, articulating every single syllable so there could be no misunderstanding. I approached the private equity firm holding your secondary construction loan on Friday morning. I purchased the commercial note in its entirety. I am now your primary secured creditor. Richard's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. He was physically paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the catastrophic ambush he had walked into. "You missed your required capital payment at midnight on Thursday?" I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy air like a scalpel. "You failed to cure the delinquency. Under the specific covenants of your private equity contract, you are officially in total default." The local business owners seated at the adjacent tables suddenly sat up very straight. They understood commercial finance. They knew exactly what the word default meant in the context of high-interest corporate debt. They realized they were not watching a family reconciliation. They were witnessing a hostile corporate takeover playing out in real time. Because you chose to finance your luxury plaza using unsecured mezzanine debt, I explained carefully, ensuring the church elders and the neighbors understood the mechanics of his ruin. The legal remedy does not require a public court battle. The default provisions grant the debt holder the absolute right to execute a strict foreclosure on the equity shares of the corporate entity. I took a slow breath and delivered the final fatal conclusion. I executed that strict foreclosure yesterday afternoon. The transfer of membership interests is complete. I legally own the plaza now. The impact of those words hit the room like a physical shockwave. 50 guests erupted into a chaotic symphony of sudden gasps, whispered questions, and shifting chairs. The carefully curated illusion of the benevolent patriarch completely shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Richard was not a wealthy benefactor. He was a delinquent debtor who had just lost his entire commercial fortune to the very daughter he had spent the evening publicly humiliating. Richard collapsed backward into his padded dining chair. His legs simply gave out beneath him. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, looking like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for the ground to arrive. But the explosion did not come from my father. It came from the opposite end of the head table. Brent understood exactly what I had just said. My brother-in-law was a real estate developer. He knew the lethal nature of mezzanine debt. He knew the catastrophic finality of a strict foreclosure. He realized in a single blinding flash of terror that the $7 million asset he had tied his entire identity and future to was completely gone. Brent jumped up from his seat with such violent and frantic force that his heavy dining chair tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the hardwood floor. The sharp crack echoed through the dining room, silencing the murmuring guests. "That is illegal," Brent shouted. His voice was shrill and frantic, completely stripped of his usual slick confidence. His face was flushed dark red, and sweat was beading visibly on his forehead. "You cannot do that. You cannot just steal a commercial property. We have rights. We are the managing directors." He was panicking wildly, abandoning all social decorum in front of 50 wealthy witnesses. He pointed a trembling finger at me across the table. "You are a thief!" he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "You hacked into my private emails. You stole corporate documents. We will take you to court. We will have you arrested for corporate espionage. You cannot steal our company." I did not flinch. I did not take a step back. I stood perfectly still and let his frantic accusations hang in the air for a moment. I wanted the audience to see his absolute loss of control. I wanted them to compare his screaming hysteria to my perfect, unyielding calm. "I did not steal anything, Brent," I replied, my voice effortlessly carrying over his shouting. "I simply purchased a distressed asset from a motivated seller. It is a standard commercial acquisition." I directed my gaze back to the thick stack of papers resting in my father's trembling hands. I pointed clearly at the documents. "Turn to the third page, Dad," I instructed him. Richard did not move. He was completely catatonic. I kept my arm extended and pointed at the envelope until he finally registered the command. His shaking fingers fumbled with the heavy paper. He pulled the third document from the stack and placed it on top. It was the 3-column forensic spreadsheet. I did not restrict my explanation to the head table. I turned my body slightly so I was addressing the entire room. I wanted the church elders and the local business owners to hear the absolute truth regarding the generous man who had just fed them expensive steak. "The document my father is holding is a forensic financial audit," I announced clearly. Over the past 5 years, my father claimed his wholesale supply business was constantly on the verge of total bankruptcy. He claimed he could not make payroll. He claimed he could not repair his warehouse. He used those fabricated emergencies to demand emergency funding from me. I looked at Susan, who was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. I transferred $4,000 of my personal salary to his business account every single month for 60 months. I stated exposing the exact numbers to the public. $240,000 in total. I lived in a freezing apartment and drove a failing vehicle because I believed I was saving my parents from homelessness. I turned my attention back to Brent, who was standing frozen next to his overturned chair. But the audit shows exactly where that money actually went. I continued, my voice growing colder and sharper with every word. My father was not paying warehouse vendors. He was instantly transferring my monthly deposits into the operating account of Oak Creek Holdings, the hidden shell company he created with Brent. The guests in the room began to murmur again. The business owners were shaking their heads in disgust. The word embezzlement began to ripple through the crowd in hushed, astonished tones. They were realizing that Richard had not just made a bad investment, he had systematically defrauded his own child. The third column of that audit tracks the outgoing expenses from your shell company, I said, focusing my gaze entirely on my father. It shows that my emergency bailouts were used to cover the country club initiation fees for Taylor and Brent. It shows my money was used to secure the down payment on Brent's luxury imported vehicle. It shows that I have been entirely funding a lavish lifestyle for my sister, while my father publicly mocked me for being a pathetic penny-pinching spinster. Taylor let out a sharp, strangled gasp. She covered her mouth with both hands, looking frantically around the room at the 50 guests who were now staring at her with profound judgment. Her carefully crafted image as a wealthy, successful socialite was burning to the ground in real time. You deliberately commingled corporate funds and embezzled my personal savings to artificially inflate your operational liquidity, I stated, delivering the final crushing blow to their reputation. You used my money to secure a high-risk private equity loan that you never had the actual capital to repay. I looked at Richard. He looked completely broken. The arrogant, confident patriarch was gone forever. He was just a small, terrified man sitting at a table he could not afford, surrounded by friends who now knew exactly what he was. You built a $7 million asset with my money. I said, the words dropping like heavy stones into the absolute silence of the grand dining room. So I took it. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to scream or cry or perform my grief for the audience. The brutal, undeniable facts had done all the work for me. The documents resting on the white linen tablecloth were an impenetrable fortress of truth. Brent dropped his head into his hands and let out a sound that was half sob and half scream. He realized that no amount of legal maneuvering or bullying was going to save him. The property was gone. The company was gone. The money was gone. I stood at the head of the table, surrounded by the total devastation of the people who had exploited me for half a decade. I felt absolutely no guilt. I felt no remorse. I felt only the clean, sharp precision of a ledger that had finally been balanced to the exact penny. The word embezzlement is not a word that simply fades into the background of a country club dining room. It is a heavy and highly radioactive word. When it drops onto a pristine white tablecloth surrounded by crystal glasses and expensive wine, it carries a shockwave that fundamentally alters the atmospheric pressure of the entire space. I stood at the head of the table and watched that shockwave travel outward in real time. The reaction was not instantaneous shouting. It was something far more devastating. It was a rapid, contagious whispering. I observed the 50 guests who had been invited to witness my absolute humiliation. These were not random strangers. These were the most influential members of my father's carefully curated social circle. They were local commercial contractors who had extended him generous lines of credit based entirely on his country club reputation. They were the senior church elders who had praised his fabricated philanthropy. They were the regional bank managers who had approved his smaller operational loans. I watched the profound realization wash over their faces as they collectively processed the reality of the forensic audit I had just laid bare. The man who owed them money, the man who had just fed them premium steak and poured them vintage wine, was completely insolvent. More importantly, he had achieved his lavish lifestyle by systematically bleeding his own daughter dry. The social tide of the Grand Magnolia Room turned with a brutal and unforgiving swiftness. Wealthy individuals have a visceral allergic reaction to financial fraud. They tolerate arrogance and they tolerate vanity, but they do not tolerate a grifter who exposes them to toxic debt. I watched a prominent local supplier sitting at the table nearest to the window physically push his chair back and fold his napkin. He leaned over to his wife and muttered something sharp under his breath. He was already calculating how much exposure his own company had to my father's crumbling wholesale business. The church treasurer, who had been nodding sympathetically during Richard's speech just minutes prior, was now staring at my father with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Richard was trapped in the center of the wreckage. The charming, benevolent patriarch had been entirely stripped away, leaving only a terrified and exposed fraud. He looked frantically around the dining hall, searching for a single sympathetic face. He found none. The men he had spent decades trying to impress were actively turning their shoulders away from him. They were distancing themselves from the blast zone. In the span of 3 minutes, his meticulously crafted image, his entire social identity, burned straight to the ground. He was a pariah in his own sanctuary. My sister Taylor had physically shrunk into her padded chair. She had spent her entire adult life broadcasting a narrative of effortless wealth and superiority. Now the entire room knew that her imported vehicle, her country club initiation fees, and her designer clothes were financed by the stolen wages of the sister she constantly belittled. The smug, arrogant smile was completely eradicated from her face. She pulled her expensive cashmere shawl tightly around her shoulders, as if she could somehow hide from the profound public shame radiating from the surrounding tables. Brent was still hyperventilating beside her, his head buried in his hands, entirely consumed by the realization that his real estate career was permanently destroyed. But my mother was not ready to surrender. Susan had spent 30 years operating as the primary psychological architect of our family. She was deeply conditioned to believe that she could manipulate her way out of any consequence by simply escalating the emotional stakes. She saw the social capital draining from the room, and she panicked. She decided to deploy the only weapon she had left. She resorted to pure theatrical desperation. Susan stood up from her chair and rushed around the head of the table. Her emerald green silk dress rustled loudly in the quiet hall. She threw herself toward me, reaching out with trembling hands to grab my forearms. I did not step back, but I stiffened my posture, making myself an immovable object. Her face was streaked with dark mascara, and her eyes were wide with a manufactured, frantic grief. "Claire, please, you have to stop this," she begged. Her voice pitched loudly enough to ensure the remaining guests could hear her desperate plea. "You are destroying the family. You are humiliating your father in front of everyone he respects. We are your flesh and blood. You cannot just take everything from us and walk away." She was trying to flip the narrative one final time. She was attempting to cast me as the ruthless and vindictive aggressor who was mercilessly attacking her fragile, aging parents. She squeezed my arms, digging her manicured nails into my skin. She wanted me to engage in a screaming match. She wanted me to lose my temper so she could point to my anger and validate her own victimhood. I looked down at the woman who had watched me freeze in my apartment for an entire winter without ever offering me a blanket. I looked at the mother who had gladly accepted my emergency wire transfers and immediately funneled them into a luxury account so her favorite daughter could drink champagne. I felt absolutely no anger toward her. Anger requires a lingering emotional investment. I was completely divested. I gently but firmly detached her hands from my arms. I let her hands fall back to her sides. I looked her directly in the eyes, ensuring she could see the absolute finality in my gaze. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with a crystalline clarity that carried perfectly through the silent dining room. "You told me. Family takes care of family, Mom," I said, delivering the words with a slow and devastating precision. "I just secured my financial future. You should be proud." The statement landed with lethal accuracy. I had taken her favorite manipulative phrase, the exact phrase she had used to extort $240,000 from me, and I had forged it into the lock that permanently sealed her fate. There was absolutely no counterargument to that logic. I had played by her exact rules. I had simply stopped playing on her team. Susan let out a sharp, breathless gasp and stumbled backward a single step. Her mouth opened and closed, but the carefully rehearsed script was completely gone. She looked at Richard, who was still sitting frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the forensic spreadsheet resting on the white linen tablecloth. He did not come to her defense. He did not offer a single word of rebuttal. The fight was entirely drained out of him. I turned my back on the head table. I did not offer a dramatic farewell. I did not look back at Taylor or Brent. I simply picked up my small leather clutch purse, adjusted the strap over my shoulder, and began to walk toward the exit. The guests parted for me automatically. They moved their chairs out of the aisles and created a wide, clear path for me to navigate. No one tried to stop me. No one offered a word of condemnation. A few of the older business owners actually offered me small, respectful nods as I walked past their tables. They recognized the sheer professional execution they had just witnessed. I pushed open the heavy brass doors of the Grand Magnolia Room and stepped out into the long carpeted corridor. The classical jazz trio in the lobby had stopped playing. The entire country club seemed to be holding its breath. I walked past the polished reception desk and out the front doors of the building. The thick, oppressive summer heat of the afternoon had finally broken. The night air was cool and incredibly crisp. I took a deep, expansive breath, allowing the fresh air to fill my lungs completely. I walked down the sweeping driveway toward the valet stand. The young attendant brought my 8-year-old sedan around to the front curb. He handed me the keys with a polite smile. I tipped him generously and got into the driver's seat. I started the engine. The car hummed with a reliable, familiar sound. For the first time in 5 years, the peeling paint on the hood did not bother me at all. It was not a symbol of my failure. It was the chariot that was driving me toward absolute freedom. I pulled out of the country club gates and drove away from my family forever. The fallout over the next 6 months was methodical, absolute, and entirely out of my hands. I did not need to monitor their destruction because the legal and financial systems of the world handle insolvent frauds with a terrifying efficiency. Without my $4,000 monthly bailouts, Richard's wholesale supply business collapsed within 60 days. He could not make payroll. He could not satisfy his vendor invoices. The local contractors who had witnessed the disaster at the country club immediately called in his debts. Facing aggressive litigation from multiple creditors, my father was forced to file for actual Chapter 7 bankruptcy. It was a brutal public liquidation. The bankruptcy trustee seized the inventory, the warehouse equipment, and the 5-bedroom suburban home my parents had leveraged to the absolute limit. Richard and Susan lost the country club membership, the social standing, and the meticulously crafted illusion of wealth. They moved into a cramped, outdated rental property on the far edge of the county. Brent and Taylor experienced a significantly steeper and faster descent. Following the strict foreclosure of Oak Creek Holdings, Brent's professional reputation in the commercial development sector was permanently eradicated. No bank would lend to him. No private equity firm would take his calls. Without the massive distributions from the shell company, their luxury lifestyle instantly evaporated. 2 months after the Father's Day dinner, the repo men arrived at their luxury penthouse complex. They towed away Taylor's imported sports utility vehicle in the middle of the afternoon in full view of her wealthy neighbors. Brent's luxury sedan was repossessed 3 days later. Unable to meet their exorbitant monthly lease requirements, they were evicted from their penthouse. The golden child and her visionary husband ended up living in a noisy second-floor walk-up apartment adjacent to a busy highway intersection. I heard through the remaining branches of the family grapevine that Taylor was forced to take a minimum wage job as a receptionist at a local fitness center just to keep their electricity running. I did not gloat over their misery. I simply did not care. My focus was entirely directed toward the massive commercial asset I had acquired. I spent the autumn months working alongside Victor Sterling and my real estate attorney to stabilize the Oak Creek Plaza project. As the sole managing director of the LLC, I stripped away the bloated, unrealistic projections Brent had attached to the site. I brought in reputable local contractors to complete the unfinished boutique storefronts. The property was a genuinely premium asset. It had simply been managed by incompetent and greedy men. Once the primary construction was finalized and the municipal certificates of occupancy were secured, I placed the plaza on the commercial real estate market. It did not sit vacant for long. In early November, a massive national commercial development firm purchased the entire property from my holding company. The sale price was highly lucrative. I utilized the proceeds from the acquisition to instantly clear the bridge loan I had secured through Victor's firm. I paid all applicable capital gains taxes and settled the legal fees. When the final corporate ledger was balanced and the escrow accounts were cleared, I looked at the massive deposit sitting safely in my personal investment portfolio. I had recovered the entire $240,000 my father had stolen from me. But because I had executed a strict foreclosure and subsequently sold the completed commercial asset, I also recovered a staggering amount of developmental profit. I walked away with my principal investment, returned alongside hundreds of thousands of dollars in massive, unassailable interest. I was sitting in my quiet, warm, and perfectly secure condo when the final wire transfer cleared. I opened my laptop and pulled up the forensic spreadsheet I had printed for the country club dinner. I highlighted the 3 columns of data that represented 5 years of fear manipulation and theft. I tapped the delete key. I watched the numbers vanish from the screen. The document was empty. I closed the spreadsheet program and opened a web browser. I navigated to an international airline portal. I did not look for discount fares. I did not search for budget accommodations. I typed Rome into the destination field. I booked a first-class ticket to Italy for the upcoming spring season. I secured a premium suite at a luxury hotel located directly on the Amalfi Coast. I paid for the entire itinerary in full using a premium travel card. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I felt the profound, radiant joy of a woman who had finally learned the true value of her own peace. I never spoke to my parents or my sister again. They tried to reach out through secondary relatives and fake social media accounts, but I maintained a completely impenetrable perimeter. My phone number was changed. My social media profiles were locked down. The emotional extortion machine was permanently disconnected. The ledger was officially closed. The debt was collected in full. And for the rest of my life, I would never again pay a single cent for the privilege of being loved.